The battlefield stretched endlessly beneath the crimson sky, the air thick with smoke and the scent of blood. The roar of battle echoed like thunder, each explosion reverberating in the soul of every soldier. Amidst the chaos, Sergeant Daniel Jansen moved with practiced precision, his boots barely making a sound on the scorched earth. The war was not just against an enemy force, but against time and fate itself. He had faced countless battles, witnessed the destruction of entire worlds, and survived wounds that should have killed him. But none of that compared to the mission he now faced. A war for her heart. Her name was Alara, a brilliant tactician, a leader who commanded respect and loyalty in equal measure. Their paths had crossed months ago, in a distant corner of the galaxy where the stars burned like diamonds in the night. It was there, amidst the fires of war, that Daniel had first seen her, strong, determined, and unyielding in her quest to win the war for her people. But it wasn't just her strength that had drawn him in. It was the quiet moments when her guard was down, when her smile held more warmth than the sun of 1,000 worlds. Daniel knew he had to fight for her, not just for the galaxy, but for the love that had sparked between them like an ember in a storm. Yet, the path ahead was riddled with obstacles, and the greatest challenge lay in the choices that would define him. He paused behind a crumbling wall, his breath steady despite the carnage unfolding around him. Through his visor, he saw Alara leading her forces with an elegance that only she could possess. She was every bit the warrior, but there was something in her eyes that betrayed a deeper sorrow, a sorrow that mirrored his own. Sergeant Jansen, her voice crackled through the comms, calm and composed. We're pushing forward. Prepare for extraction on my mark. He looked at the horizon, where the enemy's stronghold stood tall and ominous. It was a fortress unlike any he had ever seen, a structure designed to break spirits as much as it was meant to break bodies. And within it lay the heart of the war, a powerful weapon that could change the tide in the enemy's favor, and the one thing that Alara's forces had fought so desperately to protect. But that weapon, Daniel knew, could also destroy her. His mind raced. He knew that if the weapon was activated, it would trigger a devastating chain reaction, one that would render Alara's forces unable to ever challenge the enemy again. If they failed to secure it, the war would be lost. But there was another truth, a deeper, more painful truth. If they succeeded, it would mean losing her forever. He clenched his fist around the trigger of his plasma rifle. Alara had made her choice long ago. She had always been ready to sacrifice everything. Her life, her love, her heart, for the greater good of her people. But Daniel, he had never been able to reconcile the idea of losing her, even for the sake of the universe. As he prepared to move out, his heart heavy with the weight of his decision, a message flickered across his HUD. Do you trust me, Sergeant? It was her voice again. Without thinking, Daniel activated his calm always. There was a moment of silence then make the choice, Daniel. Follow your heart. We'll find a way together. The words hit him like a wave. The weight of the galaxy, of the war, of the choice he had been avoiding. All of it melted away. There was only one thing that mattered now. Her. He stood tall, eyes locked on the horizon. The choice had always been his, and now he knew what he had to do. With Alara's voice in his ear, he charged forward, rallying his soldiers behind him. They would break the enemy's stronghold, not with weapons, but with determination. They would fight not for the war, but for the love that had bloomed amidst the destruction. The battle raged on, but as Daniel's forces breached the fortress gates, he caught sight of her, Alara, standing at the heart of the chaos, her eyes locked onto his. She didn't need words to tell him she had made her choice too. The war was far from over, but for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Daniel felt the hope of a future that wasn't shaped by fire and blood. Together, they would fight for what mattered most, their hearts. The fortress walls crumbled as Daniel's team pushed deeper into the heart of the stronghold, the sound of collapsing stone reverberating through the chaos. They had breached the outer defenses with precision, but the true battle was just beginning. Alara's message still echoed in his mind, each word a reminder of the choice he had to make. The choice they both had to make. His boots hit the cold, metal floor of the inner chambers with a heavy thud. The air was thick with the acrid scent of ionized metal, and the dim glow of emergency lights bathed the hallway in a blood-red hue. His hand gripped the hilt of his plasma rifle, but his mind wasn't on the weapons or the strategy, it was on her. The thought of losing her was unbearable, but he couldn't ignore the reality that her decision would lead them to either victory or defeat. Alara's team had split off to secure the weapon chamber. It was there that everything would come to a head. If they activated the weapon, it would cause a cascade of destruction, not just on their enemies, but on her entire faction as well, ensuring that she could never lead again and destroying all hope of rebuilding a fractured galaxy. But they couldn't let the enemy control it either. If they allowed the weapon to fall into their hands, it would be game over for everyone. Jansen, do you have a read on the weapon's location? Alara's voice crackled through his comm again, urgent but calm. She had always been calm in the face of battle, even when the stakes were at their highest. I'm moving in. Just stay focused, he replied, his voice steady despite the growing storm inside him. His eyes scanned the hallway ahead, his senses honed in on the faintest movement in the shadows. There was no turning back. A faint sound echoed from around the corner. The enemy. He motioned for his team to move into position, his heart racing. As they reached the corner, the first enemy soldier appeared, moving cautiously but with determination. Daniel's rifle hummed to life, and in one fluid motion, he neutralized the threat. But they weren't alone. More soldiers emerged from the darkness, their faces cold with resolve. A firefight broke out instantly, the crackle of energy blasts filling the air. Daniel dove behind cover, his mind still on the mission, still on Alara. He knew that time was running out. Alara, we've got company, Daniel shouted over the comm as the firefight intensified. You're going to have to hold your ground until we get to you. The weapon. I know, she interrupted, her voice tight but filled with determination. Just get here in time, Daniel. Please. He didn't answer. His soldiers were pushing forward, clearing the way as he led the charge toward her. Every second felt like an eternity. The deeper they went, the more resistance they encountered. The walls of the fortress seemed to be closing in, but Daniel couldn't afford to hesitate. Not now. They reached the weapon chamber doors, a massive reinforced structure made of blackened steel. The enemy had barricaded themselves inside, but it was clear they were stalling, buying time to activate the weapon. On my mark, we breach, Daniel ordered, positioning himself at the front of the team. His pulse hammered in his chest, but his focus was unshakable. Alara needed him. The galaxy needed them both. Ready? His team responded, their voices firm and resolute. With a synchronized blast, the doors flew open, revealing the weapon chamber. It was a massive room, filled with humming machinery, the central device at its heart. The weapon, a massive, crystalline structure, stood dormant in the center, surrounded by enemy engineers who scrambled to initiate the countdown. And then there was Alara, standing before the weapon, her hand hovering over the control panel. Her eyes met his across the room, and in that instant, Daniel saw the raw, unfiltered emotion in her gaze. She was torn, just as he was. Alara! He shouted, pushing through the wreckage of the door and rushing toward her. I can't stop it, she said, her voice thick with conflict. Her hand trembled just inches from the button that would trigger the weapon. If I do, everything we've fought for will be lost. The enemy wins. No, Alara. Daniel's voice softened. He reached out, gripping her hand firmly, stopping her from pressing the button. We can find another way. We don't have to sacrifice everything. You're not alone in this. We don't need to destroy what's left of us to save everyone else. She looked at him, her eyes searching his face, looking for the answer she knew he couldn't give. The silence between them stretched, heavy with the weight of the decision that loomed over them both. Then, the voice of the enemy commander crackled over the speakers. You think you can stop us, Jansen? You're too late. Daniel turned his gaze to the screen, where the face of the enemy leader, a cold, calculating figure, appeared. His lips curled into a smug grin. There's no escape. Your side is lost. You will both watch as your people crumble, one by one. Daniel's grip tightened on Alara's hand. Not today. He turned to his team, who had already neutralized the remaining enemy soldiers. Time was running out, but there was one option left, one final move. Alara, he said, his voice steady. If we can't stop the weapon from being activated, then we destroy it.
Together.
She met his eyes, her breath shallow. But the cost? We'll find another way, Daniel insisted. I won't lose you. And with that, they acted. Together, they initiated a final, desperate maneuver, planting explosive charges at the base of the crystalline weapon. The countdown had already started, but there was still a chance. As they raced to the exit, the detonators hummed in unison, and the weapon's energy began to pulse wildly. The explosion that followed was cataclysmic, a blinding flash of light that tore through the fortress like a storm, collapsing everything in its wake. Daniel's world went white, and for a moment, there was nothing but the sound of his heartbeat in his ears. When his vision cleared, he found himself in the wreckage, Alara's face illuminated by the debris and smoke. She was alive. They were both alive. The war was far from over, but for the first time, they had chosen something that mattered more than victory. They had chosen each other. And in that choice, they had won everything. The smoke cleared slowly, the remnants of the explosion settling into an eerie silence. Daniel blinked against the stinging heat that still lingered in the air. The fortress was crumbling, but amid the chaos, he could hear her, Alara, her voice calling his name. Daniel? Her voice was faint, strained, but unmistakable. He pushed himself up from the ground, the dust choking his breath. His hand grazed the jagged edge of a broken wall as he struggled to rise to his feet. Every part of him ached, but nothing compared to the fear that gripped his chest. He couldn't lose her now, not after everything. Alara, he shouted, his voice hoarse. Through the smoke and debris, he saw her, standing shakily, her figure framed by the wreckage. She was covered in dust, blood staining the side of her face, but her eyes were clear, determined. Are you all right? Daniel asked as he rushed to her side, his heart pounding. She gave him a half smile, though it was tempered by exhaustion. I think I should be asking you that. You look like you've been through hell. He chuckled weakly, brushing the dust from his face. You're one to talk. He reached out, gently touching the blood on her cheek, his thumb tracing a path over her skin. But you're still here. We're both still here. Alara nodded, her expression serious now. We survived. But the war isn't over. It's only just begun. And we've just made ourselves the most wanted targets in the galaxy. Daniel's chest tightened as he looked around at the destruction. The enemy fortress was in ruins, but that meant nothing if they couldn't rally their forces to hold the line. The weapon was destroyed, but the repercussions of their actions would ripple through the galaxy. The enemy wouldn't rest until they found and destroyed Alara's forces, and now, their best hope for survival was the alliance they had been fighting to preserve. I know, he said, his voice steady despite the chaos in his mind. But we've got time now. Time to regroup, to make sure we're not the ones caught in the crossfire. She looked at him for a long moment, her gaze softening. You're right. We have time, and I have you. He wanted to say more, but the moment was interrupted by a series of loud explosions in the distance and the hum of distant engines. The enemy was not done yet. Look, I can't stay here, Alara said, her expression hardening once more. She turned away, her mind already on the next move. We need to get back to our forces, reorganize. The enemy knows we're alive now. We don't have much time before they come for us. Daniel nodded grimly. I'll be with you. Wherever you go, I'll follow. She shot him a brief, determined smile. Good. Because I think we're going to need more than just luck to get through this. Together, they made their way out of the ruined chamber. The devastation around them was immense, but the resolve in their hearts was greater. Every step felt heavy, but it was a step toward something bigger, toward the future they wanted to build, despite the odds stacked against them. Weeks later, their forces had regrouped. What was left of their allies was scattered across the galaxy, hidden in outposts and safe houses, waiting for the right moment to strike back. The enemy had made their move, consolidating power and hunting down any resistance that had survived the war. But Alara and Daniel were no longer just survivors. They were leaders. Together, they rallied the scattered forces, bringing hope back to a galaxy that seemed on the verge of collapse. They were not the same people who had set foot in that fortress. They had been forged by the flames of war, tempered by loss, and united by something that couldn't be broken: their bond. As the new coalition formed, a decision hung in the air. How far would they go to fight for peace, for freedom? Alara and Daniel had shared more than just love. They had shared their darkest fears, their deepest secrets, and their shared vision of a future where they weren't defined by the wars they fought, but by the lives they rebuilt. And yet, the choice remained. How much would they sacrifice to make that future a reality? One quiet evening, as they stood at the edge of a hidden base on a distant planet, watching the stars shimmer in the sky, Alara turned to him. "Do you ever wonder if we'll ever be able to leave it all behind?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel thought for a moment before answering. "I don't know if we ever can, but I don't think that's the point. The point is that we've made it through this far. We've chosen each other every time the war tried to take us apart. That's what matters." She smiled, a soft, knowing smile. "And we'll keep choosing each other, no matter what the galaxy throws at us." They stood there together, side by side, watching the stars. They had chosen love over duty, life over destruction, and that was a victory none of them could ever take away. The galaxy might still be a battlefield, but Daniel and Alara had found something worth fighting for. And in that fight, they had already won everything that mattered. The years that followed were a whirlwind of tension and hope, a constant balancing act between war and peace. The galaxy had fractured into a dozen pieces, each ruled by different factions, some of them loyal to the old regimes, others emerging from the ashes of conflict. Alara and Daniel, once soldiers in the same war, now found themselves leading a rebellion that spanned across countless star systems. They had become more than just the faces of the resistance. They were the embodiment of its heart, a beacon of hope to those who had long given up on ever seeing peace again. But with every victory, the price grew higher. It was a war of attrition, with both sides digging in, refusing to relent. The enemy, now a conglomerate of militarized factions known as the Dominion, had grown too powerful to dismantle in one swift strike. But they weren't invincible, not with the alliance they had built. Through covert operations, backroom negotiations, and relentless campaigns, they had managed to win critical territories, key planets that could turn the tide in their favor. Yet, it was never enough. The Dominion had resources, influence, and a cruel mastery of manipulation that made every victory feel like a fleeting dream. Alara and Daniel, however, remained resolute. Together, they had come to understand that this war, unlike the others, wasn't about just defeating an enemy. It was about something far greater: healing a galaxy that had been broken beyond recognition and creating something that could last. A future where people could once again look to the stars with hope, not fear. One evening, after another of the many grueling strategy meetings that had stretched into the late hours, Daniel and Alara stood alone in the observation room of their ship, overlooking the abyss of space. The stars seemed more distant tonight, as though the universe itself was growing tired of their endless struggle. "I sometimes wonder if we'll ever see the end of this," Alara murmured, her voice quiet, contemplative, her dark eyes fixed on the twinkling stars, as though searching for a sign. Daniel stepped closer, his hand gently brushing hers. "We will. I know it. We've come too far to stop now." She met his gaze, and for a moment, it was as though time stood still between them. They had been through so much together, and yet, the fear of failure still lingered in her eyes. Not for herself, but for everyone else who relied on them. "I don't want to lose you, Daniel," she said softly. Her voice cracked slightly, betraying the weight she carried alone. "I don't know what I'd do if you weren't there." The words hung in the air, and for the briefest of moments, it was as if the war, the rebellion, everything fell away, leaving just the two of them in the quiet of the room. "I'm not going anywhere," Daniel replied, his voice firm, though the truth of those words weighed on him just as much. "But you can't carry this alone. You never have to. We've built something bigger than this war. You and me. We can make it through anything. Together." Her gaze softened, and a hint of that same warmth that had first drawn him to her returned. She smiled, but it was bittersweet. Sometimes, I wish we could just leave it all behind, she said. Find somewhere where the war can't touch us, where we can finally, her voice faltered, where we can finally be free. Daniel finished for her, his hand gently cupping her face, as if trying to memorize the moment before everything changed again. She nodded, and for a second, they stood there, lost in the thought of a life not defined by battle and loss. But even in that brief silence, they both knew the truth. The war was far from over, and neither of them could afford to abandon their cause, not now. Not when so many depended on them. One day, Daniel said, his voice low, almost a vow, we'll have that peace. The kind that doesn't come with weapons, but with the quiet of knowing it's all behind us. We'll find a place where we can stop fighting. Her smile deepened, a spark of the hope that had never truly died in her eyes. I'm holding you to that promise, Jansen. The war took another turn when an intelligence leak revealed that the Dominion had been working on a new weapon. A secret project so devastating that it could obliterate entire fleets in one strike. The coordinates led them to an abandoned moon in a remote system. If they could destroy it, they would strike a blow that could cripple the Dominion's hold on the galaxy. It was a gamble, but it was the kind of risk they had no choice but to take. Alara and Daniel's forces mobilized for one final assault, a mission that would take them to the heart of the Dominion's power. They set course for the moon, knowing it would be a suicide mission for many. And yet, as they prepared to leave, Alara stood by the ship's hatch, her eyes scanning the horizon of their ship's observation deck. This is it, Daniel. This could be the one that ends it, she said, her tone steady but laced with an undercurrent of anxiety. I know, but no matter what happens, we've done everything we can, he replied, walking up beside her. We're giving them a future where they don't have to live in fear. She turned to him, her gaze full of something deeper, something that transcended the war, transcended even the galaxy around them. And we're fighting for our future too, aren't we? He nodded, his voice quieter now. Yes, ours. Together. And with that, they both knew that no matter what lay ahead, they had made a choice. Not just to fight, but to live. For each other. For the galaxy. For a future they could both build, side by side. The war may have torn them apart at times, but in the end, it was the love they shared that had kept them together. As the ship hurtled toward the moon, toward the final battle, Daniel squeezed Alara's hand. Whatever happens, we'll face it together. And for the first time in a long time, Alara smiled, truly smiled, as the stars before them seemed to shift, as though even the universe itself was rooting for them. Together, they would face the unknown. Together, they would fight for a future that belonged not just to the stars, but to them. The final assault on the Dominion's secret weapon base unfolded like a storm. The moon, barren and desolate, was cloaked in darkness as their fleet descended into the shadow of its towering, jagged peaks. A quiet tension gripped the air, 1,000 unsaid words hanging between Daniel and Alara, as their forces prepared for what could very well be their last battle. Time to make history, Daniel said, his voice firm but tinged with something softer, an understanding between them that no words could capture. Alara nodded, her eyes reflecting the same fire that had ignited within her when they first set out on this mission. No turning back now, she said. The massive, sleek warships of their coalition hovered in perfect formation above the surface, ready to strike at a moment's notice. Below them, the Dominion's facility loomed, an imposing fortress, encased in reinforced steel, built deep into the moon's core. It was the kind of place meant to hold secrets, weapons, and, most of all, a deadly power that could shift the tide of war in the blink of an eye. Daniel stood at the helm of his flagship, the controls responsive beneath his fingers as he scanned the data feeds coming in. His team was positioned to storm the facility from the ground, while Alara's fleet would provide air support and cover fire, but he knew there was no way to guarantee success. They were outnumbered, outgunned. But what they had in resolve was enough to make up for it. We're going in, he said to his team, his voice resolute. Stay sharp. Stay together. Our mission is to make sure this weapon never sees the light of day. With that, the drop pods were released, their thrusters igniting as they plummeted toward the surface. Daniel, Alara, and and their forces descended into the heart of the beast, their weapons drawn, hearts pounding with the knowledge that this was the moment that would either secure their freedom or seal their fate. The ground beneath them shook as they hit the surface, dust rising in plumes as they scrambled out of the pods, adrenaline surging through their veins. The sound of blaster fire echoed in the distance, and Daniel's instincts kicked in. Alara's forces were already engaging the enemy, but they would need to clear the perimeter first if they were to reach the core of the base in time. As they made their way toward the heavily guarded entrance, the air crackled with tension. The Dominion was ready for them. The first wave of enemy soldiers met them with fierce resistance, but Daniel's team pushed forward relentlessly, cutting through their ranks with precision. They moved like a well-oiled machine, one step ahead of their enemies at every turn. But the deeper they went into the base, the more dangerous it became. The corridors were dark, lined with traps and automated defenses designed to slow their advance. Daniel and Alara, working as one, led the charge. There was no time to think of the stakes, only to focus on the task ahead. The explosions, the blaster fire, the clash of metal on metal. All of it became background noise to the rhythm of survival. They were closing in on the weapons chamber, where the Dominion had been making its final preparations to launch the devastating strike. The clock was ticking, and every passing second brought them closer to either success or disaster. Finally, they reached the heart of the facility, a vast chamber filled with the hum of energy fields and glowing machinery. At the center stood the weapon, an imposing array of crystalline conduits feeding energy into a massive power core, pulsating with an ominous light. The weapon could obliterate entire fleets, could tear apart whole planets if activated. But there was no time to marvel at its destructive power. They had to shut it down, and they had to do it fast. Alara moved swiftly to the control console, her fingers flying across the interface as she worked to override the security protocols. But the room began to shake as the Dominion's final line of defense activated, turrets and automated sentries lining the walls, unleashing a deadly barrage of energy blasts. The air grew thick with the hum of weapons fire, and Daniel's team scrambled for cover, returning fire as they tried to clear the room of the automated defenses. "Alara, hurry," Daniel shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. "I'm trying," she yelled back, her hands steady despite the mounting pressure. "The system's more complicated than we thought. Just hold them off a little longer." Daniel nodded, taking up a defensive position as his soldiers laid down cover fire. His heart raced, but his mind stayed sharp. Every movement was calculated, every action driven by the knowledge that Alara depended on him to keep the enemy off her long enough to disable the weapon. Minutes stretched like hours. The blast shields were down, and the countdown had already begun. The Dominion was making its final push. This wasn't just a battle to destroy a weapon. This was the last stand. If they failed, the galaxy would be forever changed. With one last surge of effort, Alara's fingers slammed down on the console, and the weapon's hum began to subside. The countdown halted, the machinery powering down. The room fell silent, save for the ragged breaths of those who had fought to keep the Dominion at bay. "It's done," Alara said, her voice barely a whisper, as she sank back against the console, exhausted but relieved. Daniel took a deep breath, allowing himself a moment of reprieve. But that moment was short-lived. A sudden blast rocked the base, and the walls trembled. Something had gone wrong. The weapon wasn't just powered down. It was destabilizing. "Alara, we need to get out of here. Now," Daniel shouted, grabbing her hand and pulling her toward the exit. The base was beginning to collapse around them. The enemy wasn't done yet. The countdown had been halted, but the damage had already been done. The weapon was in the process of self-destructing, its energy surging wildly, and they had mere minutes to escape before it erupted in a cataclysmic explosion. They fought their way through the corridors, the ground shaking beneath their feet, the walls closing in as they reached the exit. Alara and Daniel made it to the surface, barely escaping the blast radius, but the shockwave was unavoidable. It sent them tumbling, the force of the explosion throwing them across the barren landscape. When Daniel regained consciousness, the world around him was a haze of smoke and dust. His vision blurred, but he could make out Alara's figure nearby, her hand reaching toward him. He took it, pulling himself up with her help. They were alive, barely. But they had done it. The weapon was gone. The Dominion's secret weapon would never harm another soul. Exhausted, battered, but victorious, Daniel and Alara stood together in the aftermath, their eyes meeting once more. They had faced the storm and emerged on the other side, their future uncertain, but still within reach. As the sounds of victory rang through the comms, their hands found each other once more. And in that moment, they knew. The fight was far from over, but together, they would face whatever came next. And for the first time in a long while, there was hope. Real hope.